morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, June 5th, 2023. Hope you had an awesome weekend, and I'm really glad that you're here with me. And if you're anything like me, reading comments on almost any post on social or mainstream media, whatever, that has anything to do with the Constitution and liberty absolutely makes your skin crawl because it's so easy to see all the ignorance, willful and otherwise, that people show, and they do it proudly. So if you're like that at all, you're going to probably really enjoy this episode because I'm going to go through one single comment that really summarizes most of the mainstream ignorance that people have on nullification today. And it was in response to this post from Thomas Jefferson, pretty highly regarded dude at the time of the founding during the Revolution. And he told us that where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So whether everyone agreed with Jefferson or not is not the question here. But Jefferson himself is telling us that when the government goes beyond the limits that are authorized to it, that are delegated to it, the response should be a nullification by the people of the several states, by the states themselves as well. It's not just something to try later on. It's not just something in extreme situations. It's as soon as they assume powers that are not delegated to it. And we're basically telling people until people start using this type of strategy as their first choice instead of the last choice or something to try way down the line or generations in the future, government is going to keep growing and growing and growing. And here's the comment in question from LaSalleman6792. Now, mind you, we know that sometimes these things are from bots or disinformation agents, but this is actually a long-standing type of a message that we've heard from people over the years. Quote, nullification has been tried repeatedly in U.S. history. It has never worked. That doctrine, by the way, was used to justify and protect the institution of slavery in the years prior to the Civil War. Some versions of the doctrine were used in an effort to preserve segregation in the 1960s. No state can nullify an act of Congress. I mean, there's so many issues here, and as even thinking about the notes that I put together, I missed a few comments, but maybe I'll think about it as I go through it. But almost everything in this statement is factually incorrect, and I want to go through it line by line, but I want to start out with the second one. Quote, nullification was used to justify and protect the institution of slavery in the years prior to the Civil War. Now, first of all, let's take the position that, he's saying it has never worked. First of all, nullification has never worked, but somehow magically it worked to protect slavery. So in and of itself, the dude is already just all over the place and completely wrong. But more important than that, first of all, slavery was generally considered as legal under the Constitution of the United States on the national level. And then the feds, on top of this, passed two Fugitive Slave Acts. The Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then it was strengthened in 1850 to help protect the institution of slavery. So it was the federal government that was working to protect that institution. So let's state the obvious. If nullification is a state thwarting a federal act, nullifying a federal act, and slavery was legal federally, then the people who wanted to keep slavery, there was nothing for them to nullify. They weren't nullifying some federal act that said you can't have slavery, and now we're going to do it anyway. So this in and of itself is absurd on its face. It's also absurd to say it never works, but somehow it worked in order to protect some kind of racism thing. They're literally getting things backwards on top of it. So not only are they totally wrong, but they get things backwards. I'm not sure where people learn this, but this is a very common view. It was used to protect slavery. We've heard this over and over and over. Our great buddy Rachel Maddow did a 10, 15-minute segment on our work some years ago called Confederates in the Attic. So if you support nullification, you certainly are on the side of slave owners from the South in the 19th century, and you're a bad guy. But here from Mike Meharry, he said on September 18th, 1850, President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 into law. It set up a legal structure to facilitate the capture of runaway slaves and their return to their, and he put in scare quotes, owners. Abolitionists dubbed it the Bloodhound Law. It significantly expanded the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and was extremely unpopular in northern states. Mike goes on. He said the law erased any semblance of due process for an accused runaway slave. a white man could basically drag a black man or woman into slavery on the power of their own word. Accused runaways weren't even allowed to testify in their own defense. If you want to read more about that, you can on your own time, but that's a good introduction. Now, in response, states in the North were passing what were called personal liberty laws, and they had done this for a period of decades, but really ramped up after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was passed. Here, for example, the Michigan Personal Liberty Act. Here from Michigan Day by Day, on February 13, 1855, the Michigan legislature moved to protect escaped slaves to counter the harsh provisions of the 1850 Federal Fugitive Slave Law. So here's a state responding to the feds protecting slavery by fighting against it, which forced the return of African Americans who escaped the horrors of slavery. The legislature prohibited the use of county jails for detention of escaped slaves. The measure also directed county prosecuting attorneys to defend the recaptured slaves, a provision that had been denied the slaves in the 1850 law. So they're going directly head on with the Fugitive Slave Act. There's also the Vermont habeas corpus law. And here from T.J. Martinell, he said it stipulated that the state's attorney had a duty to protect, defend, and procure to be discharged any person in Vermont arrested or claimed as a fugitive slave. It also demanded that states' attorneys could obtain a writ of habeas corpus, even though, of course, the feds said you couldn't really do this for any person, quote, arrested, claimed, or imprisoned as a fugitive slave by writing to any Supreme Court or Circuit Court judge in the state. In other words, TJ writes, Vermont was nullifying the federal fugitive slave law in practice. There were a lot of abolitionist people who were suddenly nullifiers. Of course, we think of the nullification crisis of the 1830s, but there was also a nullification crisis in the 1850s, and this was the northern states nullifying the federal government on slavery. Here's John Greenleaf Whittier, abolitionist poet. He said, since the passage of the fugitive, they were asking him to run for Congress, and he's saying, hey, man, I'm taking positions that maybe some of you guys aren't into, and this is what it is. Since the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law by Congress, I find myself in a position with respect to it, which I fear my fellow citizens generally are not prepared to justify. So far as that law is concerned, I am a nullifier. So here's an abolitionist outwardly saying, I'm a nullifier. We have to nullify. He said, by no act or countenance of mine shall that law be enforced in Massachusetts. Nullification in action, in practice, and effect. And when asked about this, writing in The Liberator, which is a very famous abolitionist newspaper of the time, William Lloyd Garrison put it this way: the nullification advocated by Mr. Whittier is loyalty to goodness. We saw Southern papers attacking northern states. Now, it wasn't just Vermont and Michigan. It was basically all of the states in the North. But here, the Richmond Whig and Public Advertiser had a sarcastically titled article, Nullification Made Easy. Quote, when it becomes apparent that the Fugitive Slave Law's operation is practically nullified by the people of one or more states, differences of opinion may arise as to the proper remedy, but one thing is certain, that some ample mode of redress will be chosen in which the South, with entire unanimity, will concur. So here's a Southern newspaper also saying, well, you're nullifying the federal act. We don't like it. You don't have to agree that this was something that they should have been doing, but it certainly was happening. Here's another one. T.J. Martinell writes, one D.C. newspaper maintaining the respectable opinion at the time wrote that Vermont's law, quote, plainly and intentionally overrules and sets aside the Constitution and the law of Congress. One Boston newspaper even accused Vermont of direct and open nullification of a law in Congress, so not just the Southern papers, northern ones as well. The New Orleans Bee put it this way: fortunately, too, her position is such that she will probably never have occasion to attempt to put into practice her vile theories of nullification. The vile theories of nullification were the ones rejecting the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. If she ever would, they wrote, we rely on the president and on the people of Vermont themselves to bring the state back to reason and to prove that nullification north or south of the Potomac will be put down at all hazards. So, short version is, this happened quite a bit in the North in the 1850s and beyond, and actually well before that as well. I covered it in some detail in an episode a few years ago now, almost 4 years ago, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and nullification by northern states. I'm going to link to this and everything else over in the show notes. I publish a blog post. Today I'm going to be a little bit later than normal. I got a few things to do right after the show, but I'll publish a blog post for this a little bit later today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And there in the blog post that I publish for every episode, you're going to find all the stuff that I'm mentioning as references for the show. Hey, Bolden, where's that episode? Where's that article? Et cetera, et cetera. You're going to find that all there on show links. Plus, you're going to find all the different platforms around. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, and probably elsewhere. But we also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. We have the audio version over at Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, all the rest. Basically anywhere and everywhere we're able to be. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while I'm taking a quick moment here to do this kind of marketing message, whatever we want to call it, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I appreciate you, whether you're not, you're watching or listening to the archive as well. Thank you so much. There's Tim Martin in Arizona, John Rame in Central Valley, California. Sunny up there, raining down here. Senator DT in Elkhart, Dixie Strong in Bama, Cheriton Farmer, Haji, Senator DT, Dave Simmons, Douglas Fox, Joseph Collin, King Nobody, Raphael Migliano, Larry Clark, Derek Sexton, and everyone else. There's Kirk Morrison. I appreciate you guys all being here. Joseph and everyone else. I know I'm skipping a few people, but I got a lot of info to cover here. And again, thank you so much. So the Fugitive Slave Act being nullified by the northern states. Now, if you don't want to take my word for it, because I'm telling you this stuff, you don't want to take these quotes from these papers and these people talking about Vermont and Michigan and other states nullifying the federal government on slavery, and you want to just agree with our commenter who said, you know, it was just used to protect slavery, which is, I don't know, it's so dumb because this is totally opposite of what actually happened. It really shows that we're all victims of government-run education, the so-called government school system, and even the non-public, so-called public, I hate that term, the non-public school systems are still generally, most people are still learning government-approved materials. So we're all struggling from cradle to grave to unlearn all the garbage that they've been shoving down our throats. And I think those of you who are here, I think it's pretty awesome. Like, we run a kind of a niche show here. This isn't done to be a super popular one, but I'm sharing the information that I'm learning. So you can learn as well, and maybe, well, we can start creating a foundation to turn this mess around. But anyways, if you don't believe me, what did South Carolina have to say about Northern nullification in 1860? Here, the South Carolina Declaration of Secession, formally, and this is from Wikipedia, I'll link to this so you can read it as well, formerly known as the Declaration of the Immediate Causes which Induce and Justify the Secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union. This was a proclamation issued on December 24th, 1860. The timing on that should be pretty obvious if you know the history, by the government of South Carolina to explain its reasons for seceding. So not only did they secede, but they explained why, and they put it in some detail. This is the situation, this is the structure, and this is what's going on. It followed the brief ordinance of secession that had been issued on December 20th. So just a few days later, they made a very public declaration of why. And you can think of, well, this was a common thing in the founding generation for the old revolutionaries as well. So even when after a few months after the fighting had broken out in 1775, Lexington Concord and beyond, well, Jefferson and Dickinson and the Second Continental Congress, they put out a paper that said the Declaration of Causes, why they're taking up arms. And so this was kind of a call to that type of thing. And again, you don't have to agree with them or not, but let's hear what they have to say in their own words. Well, first the synopsis, and this is where Wiki kind of goes off the rails a little bit. They kind of hide a little bit what's going on here. They say the opening portion of the Declaration outlines the historical background of South Carolina and offers a legal justification for its secession. That is factually correct. Now, the next part sounds factually correct, but it's actually editorialized because they remove some of the important statements about this. The next section, so section 1 says, here's why we can do this legally. This explains the structure, how we view things. And here's our explicit reason why we're saying we're out of here. The next section asserts that the government of the United States and of states within that government had failed to uphold their obligations to South Carolina. The specific issue stated was the refusal of some states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and clauses in the Constitution protecting slavery and the federal government's perceived role in attempting to abolish slavery. So it sounds like, oh, the states didn't just help out. But South Carolina themselves actually was a little bit more clear. And I think this, maybe it'll make sense here. So first of all, they say, and this is in section 2, and it's not really, you can just kind of tell by the way it's laid out. And again, I'm going to link to the whole document so you can read it yourself. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused for years past to fulfill their constitutional obligations, and we refer to their own statutes for the proof. So that's where Wiki gets it right. But they skip over this thing. Quote, the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. So specifically, South Carolina is saying you are supposed to be helping the federal government under the Fugitive Slave Act. You're supposed to help return runaway slaves. You're refusing to do this, and you're either not participating or you're outright nullifying them. They are actively complaining about nullification by northern states of a federal pro-slavery law. And then they said for 25 years, this agitation has been steadily increasing. So this second claim, that nullification was used to justify and protect the institution of slavery in the years prior to the Civil War, is so dumb. It is totally false. It's totally backwards. It was the northern states that were using nullification against slavery. Now, I don't remember, especially because I was a really bad student. I was a terrible student in government-run schools. I wasn't paying attention. I was a troublemaker, and maybe that ended up being helpful for me because I wasn't paying attention to the propaganda they were shoving down my throat. I don't remember ever being taught this kind of thing. But almost everybody you come across, unless they've actually done some research, will automatically say, well, nullification was used in support of slavery. And I can't understand how that was the case. Not just the fact that, first of all, there was nothing to nullify. And then on top of it, the northern states were nullifying. So this is totally false. But on top of it, we have the claim number 1. Nullification has been tried repeatedly in U.S. history. It has never worked. First of all, again, if they were saying if it has never worked, but somehow they magically were nullifying laws that prevented slavery by, supporting slavery, then it did work, first of all. So on either side of this is total nonsense. But on top of it, if we're going to agree with what South Carolina had to say, or just take it on its face value, they're saying that these 14 northern states were very effective with their nullification of the federal Fugitive Slave Act. And it wasn't just South Carolina. There were other states that had similar statements. And then it wasn't just the Fugitive Slave Act where nullification has been effective. Our State of the Nullification Movement report, which we published once a year, usually, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, it goes through some other examples throughout history. We can say alcohol prohibition was, in essence, nullified by people and the states. We can go all the way back to the Stamp Act. Plus, in current times, we have many things where we see it playing out before our very eyes, the Real ID Act, cannabis prohibition, and more. So let's go to this next claim. Some versions of nullification of the doctrine were used in an effort to preserve segregation in the 1960s. And I'm going to say this is mostly just wrong on a technicality. And so maybe we could say, yeah, they got this. Well, we can give them this one. But I still think there's something to say here, and it's important to point out. First of all, 1960s is mostly incorrect. Most of the nullification efforts during the segregation crisis was in the 1950s. We did see a resurgence of it in the early 60s, but if you think about it, 1950s, we have Brown versus Board of Education. We have what happened in Little Rock, Eisenhower sending in troops, Cooper versus Aaron, the Supreme Court case, which is the opinion is just terrible, but on top of it, they explicitly say you can't nullify. But in the end, the whole effort of this desegregation crisis was decided by the courts, and the states backed down. Here you see a picture here, and again, I'll link to this as well. This is Governor George Wallace on June 11th, 1963. In a symbolic effort, here's how they put it at Wiki, in a symbolic effort to keep his inaugural promise of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and stop the desegregation of schools, he stood at the door of the auditorium as if to block the entry of two African-American students, Vivian Moore and James Hood. And this is the one that we're shown over and over again. Nullification is evil because they want to keep people separate based on their race. But if you think about how this played out, and of course, I'm not on that guy's side. I'm not on anybody's side on this. I want people to have free choice, but that's a different conversation. So he did this, and supposedly this was a big nullification effort, but it's almost laughable to say that. It almost looks like, to me, political grandstanding, because on that same day, JFK issued, this is the same day, June 11th, 1963, JFK issued Executive Order 11111. 4 hours after he issued that executive order, Wallace backed down. So nullification lasted for 4 hours on this one. So on the one hand, I would say a state attempting to nullify that backs down within 4 hours, they aren't really attempting to nullify. They may sound like it, but nullification isn't about getting approval. And then on top of it, if you look at what happened in the 50s, all the states over time backed down in response to federal court rulings. Nullification has nothing to do with getting approval from a federal court. So if they start doing something and a federal court tells them they can't and then they stop doing it, then they're not really trying nullification. They're just trying to create a conflict to get a court case to get the federal government to rule on their side. This is the same as what everybody else does. So I could say, on one hand, these efforts in the 1950s and even 1960s, 1963, these weren't really an effort to use nullification. They were using the rhetoric of nullification. But even if you could point out that I'm totally wrong on that, and I'm happy to just say, okay, cool, whatever. This is the biggest nullification failure in history. The biggest nullification success was possibly the response against the federal slavery law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And the biggest nullification failure was to preserve segregation. So that, I think, throws off this idea that this was just used to support segregation and it's bad, etc., etc. And so we can look at claim number 4 here. No state can nullify an act of Congress. They just can't do it. Don't waste your time. Of course, if you've heard me talk about this, you know that back in 1996, I was just a little baby and doing this kind of work here. I wasn't even doing this kind of work, but I was kind of paying attention. I just moved to Southern California from the Midwest, and whoa, this weird cannabis legalization thing happened in the fall of 96. I had only been here just a little over a year. And over that time, that summer, we had all kinds of people coming to tell us here in California, 2 former presidents, I believe, and 1 current one at the time. They said, you can't nullify supremacy. You can't do this. They don't think they use nullify. They may have. Today, they use it for any time a state does something that the feds don't want them to do. It doesn't matter which team is in power. They say this is an illegal nullification. This kind of Confederate stuff can't stand, and we're going to shut it down. We heard it in the previous administration. We probably heard the one before that over and over and over. But what we heard in response to Prop 215 was you can't do this supremacy clause, but the people did it anyway. So if no state can nullify an act of Congress, the Real ID Act would be in effect today. It is not in full effect, except where people are volunteering to participate or states are volunteering. The feds would have stopped all the states on marijuana. They didn't. They even had a Supreme Court opinion in 2005. And at that time, where they held basically that if you grow a plant in your backyard, you consume it in your own home, it never crosses state lines, you don't even buy or sell it, you plant it yourself, that's somehow interstate commerce and the feds can prohibit it. At that time, there were 10 states that had medical marijuana programs on the books. Today, it's like 37 plus 23 recreational. So even in the face of a Supreme Court opinion against the states kept pushing on. So if no state can nullify an act of Congress or the people can't do it, then marijuana would be illegal everywhere. And the northern states would not have blocked enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, but they did. I think that supporters of the monster state, they just want you to be dumb. They want you to look at this and say, like, oh, goodness, nullification, racist, bad. And yes, I know they absolutely use nullification language in support of keeping segregation. I'm not on board with that. I don't think that's cool. I mean, maybe I don't think you should either, but, I'm not, well, whatever. I'm not on board with that, but it was a total failure. And I would argue this wasn't really a good nullification effort. And if you still think it is, well, the one that was for the really bad reason didn't work. And maybe there's something to that. So just like in our initial post, we still take the position, even though they want us to all think you can't use nullification. Don't try. It's a waste of time. Just like those presidents told us in 1996, don't vote for Prop 215, because if you do, you can't. We're going to shut you down. If we don't shut you down immediately, we're going to take you to court. It's going to be held unconstitutional. And as soon as it gets held unconstitutional, you're done. But all that turned out to be false because they did it anyway. They took them to court. They won in court, and the states and the people have done it anyway in huge numbers. And that's really what it gets down to. That's what nullification is all about. Not waiting for that approval from the federal government. And what Jefferson said, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Or if you hate Jefferson, why don't we take his arch enemy, Alexander Hamilton, who in Federalist 33 put it this way. It will not, he's talking about supremacy and the Supremacy Clause. He said, it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. So they're not supreme law. They will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Now, that doesn't mean Hamilton was a nullifier, but what is he saying here? If you see something as an act of usurpation and it deserves to be treated that way, and all branches of the government are involved in that usurpation, is it about waiting on your knees? I'm certain Hamilton would be okay with that, on your knees, for the federal government to give you permission. But this is what he said. These are acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. And I think ultimately it's really up to the people and the states to use this tool, this nullification, even if you don't want to call it nullification. That doesn't count as nullification. I don't care whether our friendly commenter or the people in power like it or not. And I think Walt Whitman had a great poem on this. It's called Walt Whitman's Caution. That's what it was originally titled. Later on, it was changed to the States. It was written somewhere in that time between 1856 and 1860. I believe it was first made publicly available in 1860, first published, but who knows? And here's how it reads. And I've got an image of the original draft text of it in his handwriting that I will link to in the show notes. Pretty cool stuff. But this is how Whitman put it. Again, abolitionist and nullifier. To the states, resist much, obey little. To the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, nothing helps us get this kind of work done every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. You got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing. Throw it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We will use it. We are incredibly efficient in how we use our financial resources. We do a lot on just a shoestring, standing for the Constitution and liberty, how to defend both when government refuses to do its job, which is 24/7, 365. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will take a look over in the chat a little bit later today and tomorrow. I generally stick around in the chat on YouTube and Rumble and Odyssey for a couple of hours after the live broadcast is done. I'll be taking a look there in just a few minutes as well. I appreciate you being here. I'll get that blog post published for this episode a little bit later today at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great Monday, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.